ANS for nuclear bloggers to have a conversation with Nuclear Regulatory Commission Chairman Stephen Burns. Before I introduce our guest and open the conversation, I want to go over a few ground rules for this hour. We will be ending at noon Eastern Time, so I ask that you please keep any background that may be needed leading up to a question to no more than a few sentences. Our time is short, and we want as many of you as possible to have a chance to ask your questions. Also, in the interest of time and in fairness to all, you may have only one follow-up for each question. I will alternate among the questions asked via webinar chat from those who are with us and the questions others are able to participate today. From those who are of priority, and I will do my best to get as many in as possible during this hour. We have a number of people on the webinar today who are not nuclear bloggers, and we appreciate that you've joined us today. We want to remind everyone that this event is provide active opportunity to ask questions of the NRC Chairman. I ask if you are not a blogger that you do not add your questions till the webinar until we are blogger questions. If there is time to open the question who are participating, appreciate your cooperation.
Craig, if I can
to begin with a brief opening statement, and we will start with questions immediately after that. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I look forward to this. We were talking just before we began. It's not quite a year since I came back to the NRC, and when I came back, I did not expect to be in this role as the chair. Given when I was coming in, I thought Chairman McFarland, who had been reconfirmed, was going to continue on. But it's been an interesting journey over the past year, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of those things that have been going on during our conversation this morning. People always ask me in terms of goals or objectives, and one of the things that I think, particularly coming into the agency and having worked at it before, you recognize to some extent you take an environment and start working through and trying to make sure that we keep on track. We keep on track as an agency, that we're responsive to the environment around us. So in some ways, these are not things that I come in and say we're going to replace all the furniture in the room and start anew. Part of it is working through some, I think, important initiatives that the agency had underway since the time I was gone in Paris, but actually in some respects had started before I left the agency. So, number one, I think the issue is through our what we've called Project AIM, which began in terms of its development a year ago last summer. Continue to work that through because, again, I think it's an opportunity for us to look at ourselves as an agency, assuring that we're focused on the right things, resource-wise, as well as capability-wise, and that's certainly something from the standpoint of the Congress that they're expecting us to do. And if you listened to the hearing yesterday, you will have certainly gotten that impression. I think the second thing, and again, this is the one I alluded to that I think began before I left for Paris, which was when the agency was putting together the steps with respect to the response to the Fukushima Daiichi accident. And so from my perspective, the credibility of the agency, but also I think in support of the industry efforts, we need to continue on in terms of the timelines we've set and bring those things home, if you will. And I think there's been a lot of good progress on that. I've taken a chance when I've had it in terms of visits to plant sites around the country to see the types of things they're doing. So at North Anna, Watts Bar, Braidwood, those are some examples. I'm going to Fermi next week because I think they're doing some of the installation or work related to the hardened venting at the site. So we're going to be able to sort of observe and talk to the folks there on the site. So again, that I would say is the second thing. That's another area that's important. And finally is probably in areas, and here it's probably either end of the spectrum. Actually, I think it was Senator Whitehouse sort of touched on this in the hearing yesterday. I think we decided we need to get a better process in terms of the decommissioning, because we are going to face that, whether it's early decommissioning or when it comes eventually. But looking at the process in terms of its effectiveness, and we're in the midst of doing that. But the other piece of it too is being prepared on the advanced technologies. We had a workshop with DOE a couple weeks ago on advanced reactors. We are getting with the small modular reactors and the NuScale application by the end of next year. So again, I think from my standpoint, being prepared for that is an important aspect of the work I see in front of us. And let me stop there.
Sure. So one question that's come up, and it refers specifically to Project AIM 2020 that you referenced in your opening statement. The notion of staff reduction targets. What do those look like for you? How do you think you're going to accomplish them this year? Are there going to be layoffs? How are you approaching this issue?
Well, what the Commission did in looking at the staff's paper and the recommendations the staff made to us on Project AIM is we set a target of 3,600 FTE, basically 3,600 staff, by the end of the fiscal year 2016. And I think we're going to be able to do that. We're not going to do it. I don't think we're going to need to use the layoff procedure, what they called in the federal government, the RIF procedure. What we have done is we recently received approval from the Office of Personnel Management to offer buyouts and early outs to folks. And I think that's actually just opening at the end of this week or the beginning of next week, and there's a defined period. I think we're authorized to somewhere around 100 that would go. And what you're able to do there is to focus it in areas where you think you have overages. For example, in this issue, and if those who follow the our congressional oversight, this issue on corporate support or overhead. And in terms of some of the growth of administrative staff that was supporting the various offices at a point where we were growing, where we had that large volume of new applications on the docket. So those buyouts are sort of smartly focused on certain areas where we think we have overages, and I think we're hoping they'll be successful. But we're in a good position in terms of normal attrition as well as using some of those tools, I think, to get to that 3,600 target. Those of you who read the AIM report, it mentions 3,400. That's what I'll call that a soft number, because the Commission wants to look at that in the context of as we get closer to that time. Is that the number makes sense? Maybe it's a little bigger, maybe it's a little smaller, but I recognize in the report it has that number.
So a somewhat related question here. You mentioned it in your opening statement. The NRC and the DOE just did a joint workshop at the end of August on advanced reactor licensing. And if you look within the community, you see a lot of excitement about advanced technologies, even though the implementation of them are still probably decades away. So really sort of two questions. One that leverages off the first, which is as you begin Project AIM or continue Project AIM, how do you make sure that you staff up in the areas, especially as it relates to non-light water reactor technologies, within this backdrop of an overall cut? And second of all, can you give us some thoughts on, I mean, we heard a little bit in the conference, but can you talk a little bit about where you see the pathway in licensing? Is that Part 50? Is that potentially bringing back Section 104? How do you see it from a legislative standpoint?
Okay, that's good questions. I think that, with respect to Project AIM, part of this focus, one of the focuses is what we call a strategic workforce planning, and part of that is looking at the types of disciplines we need, not just now, but leaning forward. The question of planning, this is where I think our engagement with the industry and industry input with respect to the interests and where things are seen. I realize it's difficult to forecast. It's difficult to forecast 5 years out, much less further than that. but having an idea, I think, what the kinds of disciplines we need and what the kind of work is that we expect to see, that helps us in that regard. At bottom, the agency is very concerned about maintaining its core competencies, particularly in the engineering and scientific areas where it has expertise. And we all know, I'm sort of the oddball, having retired and then come back. But I know when I went, and I saw this even in my office when I was in the general counsel's office, this, in effect, this generational shift and the need to bring new people on. Let me leave that at there, because your second part of your question, and I think, is a good one as well. And that's the question: what's the path forward? And I think there may be a blend here of the old, I'll call it the old two-phase licensing under Part 50, and what we call, what I think the interesting thing, we call it the new Part 52 process, but of course Part 52 is now about 25 years old. Relatively. But we are only exercising some of it. If you look at, say, Bogle and Summer, there are a few things like ITAC closure that are coming up are important things. Those are the first times we'll actually exercise those in that case. And I know there's an interesting, I think there are interesting perspectives on the efficacy of one versus the other. I think there may be some sort of blend. Obviously, NewScale and the SMR, they've had a lot of discussion with the staff. Would look like they're coming in, doing the design certification process. What I heard, I wasn't able to attend all of the conference we did with DOE, but what I've heard, the outcomes, what I heard from the conference as well as in other fora, is that some sort of ability for us to give, whether it's a topical report or more stepwise, sort of a stepwise nod, that this looks good, this should get you to where we need, where the NRC needs to be. That may be an important way of doing it. I recognize that it may not be the full, complete licensing decision in that phase, but if you have something we can do in terms that gives a fair degree of certainty, that's what at least what I'm hearing, is what folks are looking for.
Well, because it seems almost like the licensing process is coming around 180 degrees, where 25 years ago with Part 52, you wanted certainty all the way through the process, whereas now the focus is on venture funding and rounds of funding and getting that early sort of, affirmation of, hey, we kind of like your design, now, bring us the next chunk. Do you see Part 52 allowing for that?
Well, in a way, it might, but that extends, I think that makes it a more extended Part 52 process, because and I'm blanking right at the moment in terms of, I think maybe it is like the topical reports or these preliminary design approvals or preliminary decisions that ultimately could be folded into the 52 process. The question may be even, again, because with Part 52, the idea was this certainty about design certification. You didn't go in and relook at the basic design. Even though that might be an advantage, it could well be that going back to a process that doesn't have that kind of certainty under Part 52 might still have some advantages. One of the things that I think the lessons learned in talking to some of the vendors and as well as the builders, I mean the licensees at this point, is that, for example, in 52, there's certainty, but then if you need to adjust, if you refine the design, the need to go back and amend, which has a process itself that I think, and I won't call it really so much an unintended consequence, but a natural consequence of the the certainty is that if you change, then you need to go through a process again. And I know there's some debate and discussion over that issue as well.
Right, great. Well, we're going to go to a question from one of our participants in the room here. If you would announce your name and your publication, and feel free to ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Julian Spector, and I'm with City Lab at the Atlantic. And I was wondering, I mean, it seems like another big challenge facing the nuclear power is the economics of it and making it, you know, financially viable as natural gas gets cheaper. And could you talk about, you know, where do you see the financial side of it going in the years to come, and can your organization, I mean, what sort of ability do you have to try to make it cheaper and more viable for new projects to start up?
Yeah, well, in the first instance, obviously, is the regulator, in terms of finance, on the finance side, and in terms of the electricity supply side, we don't have a role, or certainly not a direct role. I do think, however, that we need to be open and listen to the concerns that the industry has with respect to impact of regulation, and in terms of how we do it. We ultimately, it means we still need to meet our bottom line criteria. We've adequate protection, public health and safety, and common defense and security that we're charged with doing. But I think a couple ways that we can continue to engage on matters related to that issue, the economics, are how we engage with the industry as regulations develop. This has gone in the last few years what we call the cumulative effects of regulation in terms of the timing, assuring that we have a good understanding of the impacts. We've been criticized in a couple instances by our Inspector General and the GAO in terms of how we do some of the cost benefit. We're addressing that. I think that's probably the main place for us, and I think that's a matter of continuing engagement with the industry in that. I will be the first to confess I do not understand the economics of the grid and how those types of things are working or not working. I think some of it is how they're not working. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Kind of on the other end of the spectrum, there was a hearing yesterday in the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. And in that hearing, the topic of decommissioning came up within the context of San Onofre. And you took a little bit of heat from the ranking member of the committee about the situation there, and really the emergency planning zone as it relates to the fuel. And her contention was that the emergency planning zone should really only be shrunk once the fuel is out of the spent fuel pool and into dry cask storage. But NRC, what's NRC's position on that?
Well, the staff had looked at this in terms of the evaluation of the risk of storage in the fuel pool, particularly with fuel that's been there for, I forget the time period. Actually, with San Onofre, it's actually been out of the reactor for several years. But I don't hold me to particular time frames, but I think you're 1 to 2 years out of the reactor. You're in the pool. In terms of your overall risk profile.
Not really hot anymore.
Yeah, it's not hot anymore. And the staff, and this is recommendations that the staff made and the commission acted on, I think, before I came back. We may have actually voted on the approval and the exemptions after I came back. But the primary analysis the staff had done is that the risk profile gets you to the point that the full-blown emergency planning framework that we have isn't necessary at that time, and thus the staff would recommend the exemptions. I think, just to play off on the decommissioning, the effort toward a new decommissioning rule, I know even talking with some of the utilities are going decommissioning is that, they cringe when they heard the word exemption as well, because it becomes this semantic one.
Right.
You're saying you don't have to meet safety requirements. Well, that's not really the case. You have to meet safety requirements, but we recognize that at a certain point, in effect, the benefit, there isn't the sort of the benefit that matches the risk of the full-blown requirements that might be imposed.
So that really sort of drives toward a rulemaking process, would you say?
I think that does it, and I think we've also heard, I think, from utilities who have gone through it, I think there are ways of making it smoother, because even with the exemption process, and it's not like exemptions are new. The idea of an exemption has been contemplated since the beginning. There was, I think, as I recall, major reform of the rule in the 1980s, but it's still a little more cumbersome. I think what I've heard from some utility is still a more cumbersome process, and not only because of the semantics. I think it's just in terms of what they need to do, it may not be as well defined, and so I think those are some of the things we'll look at in the rulemaking.
Great. Well, so I've got a couple of questions from the line. The first one is, what are your views on the Clean Power Plan and the role that nuclear will play as states begin to develop their implementation plans?
We really don't have a role in it. So we really don't have a position on it. It's not something I would not have expected us particularly to have been consulted on, which we weren't during the process of its development.
So strictly regulatory, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Right.
So I have another question previously submitted, and I'm going to read this one because I think it's word for word, because I think it's well constructed. So while the NRC conducts a vast majority of its public meetings without incident, there's a disturbing trend in public discourse taking place on the Internet, which is spilling over from virtual to real life. It includes shameless bullying, idiosyncratic interruptions of the process, and deliberate efforts to undermine public confidence in the legitimacy of NRC's decision-making and the rigor and diligence of compliance by nuclear utilities with these decisions. The NRC and the nuclear industry need to cooperate and find new ways to ensure that when people show up at a hearing or a public meeting, that they feel safe and secure knowing that a civil process will take place. There was a January 15th study about ways to improve public outreach. I think the question here is you know, what does the NRC need to do to ensure civility at these meetings, and what, you know, will you look at the task force recommendations, and what's your plan here? Yeah.
No, I think at the outset, our objective is to have civil meetings in terms of feeling safe for the participants, and not only safety but also ability for various viewpoints to be heard. I can remember early in my career going to a meeting out at actually for the Marble Hill facility, which eventually was not built, and it got pretty hot here and there. And I know we've had a couple, and I'm not, without naming particular place names, I think we've had some real challenges in a couple areas in the country. I think what we can do, and I think looking at our task force, the task force report, but I think our folks need to work with local officials, with wherever and whoever owns the property where we're holding the meetings. Sometimes if that's sometimes it's in a hotel, but if it's in a local government or a state government facility, working with them, making sure they understand the environment. And then I think setting a tone, and I think at the meeting itself, it's a easier thing to do in some places than others. I think it's something we just have to keep working at. But I agree. I think we should have an environment where people feel safe and people are able to express themselves as we want them to do in this democracy. One of the things I might mention is we had, and here I will name And one place where we have had sometimes challenging meetings is out at Diablo Canyon. There was a recent forum that in part I think was sponsored by Representative Capps, and my understanding that one went very well. It was good dialogue from the various presenters, but I think the audience remained respectful. I think there's probably some things we can learn from that.
So I have sort of a related question here,
okay,
which is, if you look by any objective measure at nuclear energy and technology, it's one of the it's extremely safe, and certainly on the energy side, if you look at the record, you don't, in terms of, I mean, if you boil it down to death per megawatt hour generated, it's probably one of the lowest of any form of energy. But invariably with nuclear, there is a psychological element here. There's an element of fear. And so I guess my question is, as the NRC approaches the job, and really it's on a scale where on one end you have, we stick to the science and we make complete decisions that are loyal to the science and scientific and technical merits. And on the other hand, you've got a situation where the fear is real, we need to acknowledge it and maybe do more than we might just on a scientific basis. How do you navigate that spectrum?
I think that's very difficult. It's a very difficult navigation. Because, as you say, in the first instance, I think having our staff making the best engineering and scientific judgments they can make, that comes first. What happens sometimes within the agency, and we've had this on a number of recent decisions, we often have robust debate among our staff about approaches to addressing a particular issue. And the good thing, I think, is the transparency with which we do that. The difficulty sometimes is, and I think the agency is a little more willing to do this than, say, it was a couple decades ago. All it would do is say, here's what we've done. Deal with it. You can read it for what it is. Mm-hmm. I think we've been a lot better. I know our public affairs office has done a lot in terms of trying to use social media, our blog, to get some issues out there in terms of how we look at what our perspective is on it. It's meant to be a little more plain language and an engagement. So some of those things can help. I mean, again, we have this the difficult position that, quote, we're not a, quote, promotional agency. But I think communicating why we reach decisions we make, why we think the science supports it, the engineering supports it, is very important. And one of the things, I would say internationally, one of the things we're doing, we're through my and not only internationally but within the agency itself, is we do look at risk communication and how that's taken out. But it is a difficult thing.
So I'm going to pick up on something you said there, and it relates to a question that we've received from one of our participants on the phone, which is obviously while things in nuclear are what I would maybe call steady state here in the U.S., there are a lot of countries around the world that are building new nuclear programs. They're building new regulatory regimes. How does international cooperation fit within your strategic plan, and are there any budgetary consequences to Project AIM 2020 in this area?
Well, I think what part of, I'll answer the last part first, is through Project AIM we would look at the effectiveness of some of our engagements, what we need to do at our engagements. I'm very much convinced, and I think it's more than just having lived in Paris for the last 3 years at the Nuclear Energy Agency, that there is a very consequential need for engagement in the international community. And part of it is, and of course, when I came into the business as a young lawyer in the late 1970s, part of it is I probably didn't know a little, but my impression over the years, and not just from my last 3 years, but at NEA, is that the integration or the need for integration and the globalization of this industry is exponentially greater than it was. I saw it in NEA, particularly as we were discussing liability the issues on liability, because you had companies, not only U.S. companies, but the French, the Russians interested in investment in India, and what does that mean in their legislation, and what did that mean for the international liability regimes? I'd see it as well. We continue to participate in the multinational design evaluation program. We get insights that way. And there are another lot of bilateral. I think we re-signed something like somewhere 7 to 9 bilateral agreements for cooperation when I was at the general conference at IAEA a few weeks ago with partners. So it's, I think, very important. It's very important. The knowledge we gain is important. And the practicalities, when we talk both to our staff in new reactors who are following developments of the Chinese as they build the AP1000, I talked to the folks building Vogtle. They're doing the same thing, and so that information and that you're gaining internationally is very important.
So to bring things back here for a second, another question from the line, and this I think has a lot of people talking in Washington. So the question is, at the Senate Oversight hearing yesterday, Senator Inhofe said that he was going to draft legislation to change the 90-10 fee structure. And obviously, when you're in a situation where you have, fewer licensees, and yet all these other activities, does NRC support that? What are your views on the 90-10?
Well, we haven't seen any particular legislation yet. I know the senator mentioned that he was looking, he'll be looking at that. And I think actually, as Commissioner Savinicki said yesterday at the hearing, we're bound right now to, in effect, follow the law, collect 90%, about 90%. One of the things that comes up is the question of, is something else or some leverage or leeway with respect to that in terms of innovation, would that be helpful? And that's I think that's a possibility. The question that has come up is this question of sustainability in terms of the fee structure with the number of, obviously with a larger fleet, it's spread across more, in effect, more licensees. That becomes, that is looked at as an issue. I don't know whether they're going to pursue that. But again, coming back to AIM, Project AIM, I think what we have to do is also looking at, looking at how we treat sort of overhead and corporate, what we call corporate support, in terms of looking at efficiencies and all that, so that we're not imposing an undue burden with respect to the fee structure. So our CFO has been doing, who's joined us a little over a year ago, has been doing a lot in the area, trying to be more transparent on the fees. She's held a number of meetings. I think she's going to continue to do that, because every year we have to go through the process. So we'll work with the committee in terms of looking at those issues. As they say, right as of yet, the particular parameters of it, we just don't know.
Right. Well, one of the things that, on a related note, one of the things that's come up, and again, we're back into advanced reactor space here, is that you have this, and I think some people have called it the chicken and egg scenario, where you have companies that are interested in developing technology but don't necessarily have a commercial buyer for their technology yet, and probably aren't in anywhere near a position. And so there's been this discussion in the community about the notion of what U.S. policy should be like on advanced reactors. Historically, we've adapted this sort of gestational approach where the federal government invests 50-50 all the way through the process. But now the conversation is turning to incubation, right, where you have a lot of different designs. You have the federal government provides the ability for private companies to develop those designs, but doesn't necessarily pick favorites. So in that particular instance, one of the things that's been talked about is whether or not DOE should have money available to essentially subsidize consultation with the NRC as a possible way to allow for some of that to happen, to pay for that, to pay for that consultation. But my question is sort of specific in that, does NRC need its own money there to know that it can hire people and build a program and that isn't wedded to DOE, or is there enough of a working relationship with DOE that if you know what's coming down the line, you can prepare for it mutually, and you don't need your own appropriation?
Well, I think ultimately we still need our own appropriation, because our staffing and depending on what the staffing level is got to be paid out of an NRC appropriation. The question about working with DOE, I think, is an important one, and it's something we do. And I've been trying to set up now like a quarterly meeting with John Kotek, who I guess now is nominated officially as the replacement for Pete Lyons. But we need to stay in contact, and I know at the staff level have also done that, because knowing what DOE may be doing, I think that's important for us. Again, I think in one of my opening comments in terms of this trying to forecast, that's another area where we need to know, I think, from industry and keep our doors open in terms of hearing what it is we expect coming down the pike, because that way we can plan for it. We have some resources, very modest resources in the advanced reactor area and doing some work. And again, if we see that there is the real potential or reality of some of this developing, then we can adjust for it. One of the difficulties always is the advanced planning in terms of the budgetary process, because we're already, this is where I used to always get confused. What year am I in?
Right.
What year am I in?
Right.
So again, I think it's communication with us about where things may be. I think our continued interaction with DOE, and that helps us plan, and I think it can get us to where we're a good place in terms of dealing with some of those issues.
So I'm skipping around here a bit, but a few years ago, the NRC undertook a study with in cooperation with the national academies on basically cancer and nuclear plants, and the academies recommended a fairly large and involved phase 2 study to really sort of drill down on that. But the NRC has made the decision not to fund that study. Can you talk a little bit about what went into your decision?
Essentially, our director of research, Brian Sharon, made the decision, I think, discussion with the senior staff and in communication with the NAS. And again, I'll try not to get out of my wheelhouse in terms of my expertise, but I think particularly the letter Brian wrote back to NAS sort of lays out very crisply the rationale, and that was that NAS even coming to us and saying this is what we could do in the phase 2, but what the outcome was, it wasn't clear that you're getting results or data that really tell you much, and then you could continue to collect data which probably wouldn't tell you a heck of a lot. And so from there, the question is it worth it to go forward to a full phase study? And the decision was it was not. And I know we addressed this on our blog. I think we had a blog posting earlier this week that addresses it and probably says some of the science and technical aspects a little bit better than I have. But that's I think the bottom line is that, yeah, you could go do this study, but given the very low level of emissions, conservative levels of, in terms of the regulatory standards, the low level of emissions you have from facilities, the comparison exposure rates you get, that all of us get from other ways, they're just, you could ask for the information, it wasn't going to tell you much.
Okay. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today on our Blogger Roundtable with NRC Chairman Stephen Burns, hosted by the American Nuclear Society. Once again, I'm Craig Piercy, the American Nuclear Society Washington Representative, and we're continuing with our roundtable discussion with Chairman Burns and other nuclear bloggers. So another question for you, Mr. Chairman, how's the office space situation working right now? Have you got that all figured out?
I think it's getting figured out. The building 3 actually, when I came back from Paris, I said, oh yeah, there's the third building, which was under construction when I left. We are now a minority tenant in Building 3. Actually, FDA is in there as well, although our ops center, which was a big, I think it's a very nice facility, on the size of the RIC, they give tours and things like that. But that's in there. We have a couple other offices in there. I think, the long term, I'm not sure how, we're going to have some footprint in the third building, but I think it's going to be other tenants. We're also working in terms of sort of the, what do they call it, I guess, restacking or the periodic refreshment we need to do in the buildings. I think the building I'm in, I think the last time, the White Flint one, the last time it was done was about 20 years ago. So there's some refreshing you need to do.
There's a lot of mauve and fuchsia in the color scheme there.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we're also working on renewing the lease for Building 2. But what was happening, and of course when I started out at the NRC in 1978, is we were spread all over the Washington area. We had this shuttle bus system that went from Rockville to Bethesda to H Street to Silver Spring and the like, and we were starting to get a little bit like that when we were growing, but all those outer buildings, the Office of Research, NMSS, they're all back in the White Flint complex. So that's a good thing, and we're doing that.
So I'm going to turn away from nuclear energy for a second and talk about some other issues. And let's start a little bit with molybdenum-99, everyone's favorite medical isotope. And as you know, there are a number of activities underway. There's been activities within NNSA to develop new domestic production of Moly-99. And out of that process has appeared some licensing and regulatory work that you have to do. Can you tell us a little bit about where things are and how that's being handled?
Yeah. Well, we have we have a couple applications on the dock, and actually on one, the SHINE medical application will actually come in front of the Commission later this year for the so-called mandatory hearing, because the interesting thing is they're even though it's not, I think because it's considered a utilization facility or a production, I can't remember which now. I think it's a production facility. Will get license 103, right. 104, and then under Part 50. So we will actually hold a hearing on that later in the year. And I think there are some other applications I think in-house under review. So I think that's an important thing. One of the things I worked on at the NEA before I left was helping one of the divisions with what was a joint declaration on medical isotopes that member states in OECD, and actually not only OECD member states, but others worked on, again, to address the isotope need. Now, we know the NRU reactors extended a few more years. I was in Belgium earlier this year, and theirs was being under refurbishment. But, there's a critical need, and particularly given if, as I recall again from my NEA work, if you look at the usage, the U.S. is the primary user of medical isotopes, so it's a critical need. So I think again we're in the process of some applications, looking at the applications. The SHINE is a Part 50, so this is in effect the construction permit, and it'll go from there.
Okay, great. The other question to that issue is, shortly before you came on board, and probably right as you came on board, there was an issue related to radiological sources and NRC Part 37. So there had been some language in the Senate that effectively would have banned new NRC licenses for 14 different types of radioisotopes, and really what was driving this language was some dissatisfaction or perceived dissatisfaction among the non-proliferation community about source security. But what the ultimate result was in the legislation was to allow NRC to continue to implement Part 37 and then take a look at it. How are things going? How is the new Part 37 rolling out, and are you having any problems? How's it working?
I'm not aware of any problems in terms of the rollout on Part 37. Again, I think there is important work in terms of reducing, some isotopes of interest, which is why the non-proliferation community had some concerns. But what was happening, and we were able to work with the committees last year, so that what our obligation to do is give a report, I think at the end of next year, about how is Part 37 doing. So I imagine we'll start doing, sort of collecting the data and looking at that, or putting together such a report, in next year, early next year, mid next year. And it's something I've gone out to the agreement meetings at the agreement stage, or the CPRCD, on the Radiation Control Program Directors meeting, and had some discussion with that. And so they're willing, they're interested in it as well in terms of helping the rollout on Part 37. Again, I think this is, it's something we can, I think the agency was responsible about. I think, as you may know, after an Energy Policy Act 2005, we sort of had this, we chair this periodic meeting or periodic review. We'll continue to do that. I think the next one isn't until like 2017, because I think the last one is right before I came back. So I am not aware of any big problems with Part 37. We need to, get the information to make the report and assess how it's going.
Right. So again, it's a conversation with NRC Chairman Stephen Burns. This is Craig Piercy, the ANS Washington Representative. I'm going to go. We've got about a little over 10 minutes left. We've got another question from the room. Again, if you would identify your name, your publication, and please ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah, so Julian Spector from City Lab again. So I was wondering, could you get into the, Watts Part 2 reactors should be coming online sometime this fall, and it's the first new reactor in almost 20 years. What lessons did you learn as far as the new regulatory regime updates since Fukushima? What are you taking away from that experience going forward for upcoming projects?
Yeah, it's interesting because of course with Watts Part 2 is being completed under Part 50, and the interesting thing is that if you go back and look at when it originally received its construction permit, I was in college. I once said, I was in law school, then I looked at the date, it was 1974, and I was still in college. But all kidding aside, I think, it's good for us from the standpoint of our inspectorate looking at a project like that, of a facility that's coming online. And I will give TVA a lot of credit because, as I facetiously say, it's been a permit and a project that's been around for a while. They've done an extraordinary effort in terms of assuring that current requirements are met. They've done, when I went out there, you had the Fukushima, the flex equipment, and those types of enhancements implemented. So they've done a lot of work for it. I think, again, what it helps from our staff, and it probably helps the utility as well, is that type of working through that project management, understand the oversight of basically a major construction project. It's not the construction in the sense that you were seeing at Vogel in summer in the more recent years in terms of, laying concrete and the like, but still, cabling, piping, again, looking at regulatory and enhancements and all that. That I think has been a valuable experience for our staff, and particularly as the utility transitions to operation toward the end of the year or probably early next year.
So again, we have a few minutes left. We got a chance to take a couple more questions online. We have one specifically from someone who was at a pro-nuclear person who was at the Diablo Canyon rally, and I'm just going to read this for you. It's good to work with local people in setting the tone, but she feels that the NRC meetings were not safe to attend, and she can send pictures and videos. What specifically do you see going forward? I mean, what can you say to address those concerns?
Yeah. Well, I think in areas where we think there may be a safety issue, that we've got to contact local authorities, make sure they're aware. If there's a present, I think I'm not aware of all the circumstances, but they probably make some judgment about their presence at the type of facilities. Quite honestly, I think probably holding things in a local or state government building or facility probably helps in that regard. I think the difficulty is I know that there are particular areas in the country where it's an ongoing challenge, and all I think we can do is prepare our people, make sure we're talking with local authorities. That's I think the best we can do.
Mm-hmm. So I want to shift gears again and go back and talk about Fukushima and the near-term task force. A lot's happened in the last now 4+ years. What percentage would you say that the NRC, if you look from beginning to end, how far are you toward closure?
I'd be hard to call it in terms of a percentage. I think what we're saying is, and maybe that's where you identify a percentage you want to put on it, but what we've said is that by the end of 2016, almost all plants will have done what we consider the most safety significant things. That's the flex equipment. We've done the walk-downs on seismicity and flooding. There's some of the implementation on from the information gleaned, say, from the flooding walk-downs because of the way the assessments are for particular plants. They won't have to do much more, or they'll be able to to meet the requirements that they have in that area. So I do see, and I think the Commission sees, end of 2016 is a big point in time. There are a few things, I think, on some of the hardened vents where that pushes over into 17 to accommodate some scheduling and also to integrate some of the changes. But that's really where I think the important point is, and that's consistent with what the Commission indicated would be in the important time frame back in when it had adopted the strategies back in 2011, 2012. Commissioner Ostendorf yesterday at the hearing mentioned, from his standpoint, one of the big things that was done was issuing the mitigation beyond design basis event rulemaking that addresses the station blackout, some of the emergency preparedness things, and that's a big accomplishment. And again, I think the focus is getting that rule done or back up to the Commission by the end of 2016 and going forward.
So, and I see now we have about 5 minutes remaining, and I want to ask, you have a 4-person commission now. Mm-hmm. You have a 5th person nominated. What can you tell us about her, that process, and also what's it like working in a 4-person commission?
Okay. I've met Jessie Roberson once. We were helping them out on a project. She came by to say hello, and this is before she was nominated. I know she has a deep background at DOE and in her current position, and also in industry. I will not begin to gaze into the crystal ball about what the process will be for her. I think Jeff Barron and I were very unusual in terms of how we went through the process. I will say it probably sped up by having to get things together to move out of my Paris apartment with my wife on a schedule I didn't expect. I don't expect that at this point with her. We just don't have any information. I think Senator Inhofe referenced it yesterday at a hearing in terms of trying to get some courtesy visits and all done, but we just haven't heard anything. Now, the other question about working with a 4-member commission, I think it's gone well, and this isn't the first time in the agency's history that it's been that way. Over the years, it's often like this. I think we don't always see eye to eye on all matters, but I think we are in good dialogue with each other. I do think, it is, and I think the other commission as well, do look for areas of agreement more than they look for areas of disagreement. And I know coming from my international experience, where basically you had to get at NEA 31 countries. It wasn't that you had to get them to say yes. You just had to get them to the point where they weren't willing to say no.
Right.
And so consensus, from that sense, consensus building. I think I learned a lot about that in the last 3 years, and that's what I'm trying to do here. And I think for the most part, we're working well, and we're not getting. I think there's always a specter of 2-2 votes, and there's really been very little that on certainly not on some of the big. I think what are the big issues in front of us.
So you are operating under a continuing resolution now, and given the cloudy crystal ball on congressional politics, that could be for some longer period of time. Are you going to be okay under a CR? Will that stop you in any way from doing the things that you need or want to do?
No, because basically you continue at the level at the levels that you have. So we're not. It isn't instituting a cut, and certainly not a dramatic cut. What you have to watch is in terms of you can't start quote new projects, but that doesn't mean it has to be really new. It would be I couldn't, for example, if I wanted to create a new office of advanced reactors and then commit $25 million to it. That might be one of those areas where my CFO and general counsel would probably come back and say, you got to go watch that. But our short of that, ongoing work that we have in the areas, I think we will be okay, even though the CR provides you some uncertainties.
Right. Well, on behalf of the 11,000 men and women of the American Nuclear Society, I want to thank you for coming today, and thank you for everyone out there on the phone participating and everyone here in the room. We'll have more like these in the future, so stay tuned. But in the meantime, we'll sign off, and again, thanks for your participation.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.